Welcome to Innovation Day 2023, presented by Connect. We've got such an incredible array of things happening here, supporting the life sci and tech communities in San Diego.
Welcome all of you. As they come up, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Hala Madanat. I'm the Vice President for Research and Innovation at San Diego State University, and I'll be moderating this next session with two of our panelists here that are joining me, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in a second, background-wise. But the goal of this particular session is to talk about the trends that we're observing in life sciences investment. And so I'm going to start with Sue, if you can do your quick intro to the group.
Thanks, Hala. Hi, everyone. I'm Sue. I'm an investor at Arch, based in the Bay Area. So it's really nice to come down here and see the beautiful weather in the ballpark. So Arch is an early stage venture capital fund. We work with scientific founders and entrepreneurs really in the very early stage of company building. So as early as ideation, conceptualize the business model, the ideas, and how to take it forward. Arch has been around for more than 30 years. So the model really hasn't changed. And a lot of time is focused on life science. Physical science is very broad spectrum, but truly disruptive technologies. And very flexible approach, anywhere from investment from a few $100,000 to hundreds of millions. So lots of flexibility there. So my focus in Arch is in therapeutics, so drug discovery development. And my formal education is in organic chemistry. I learned business on the job. So just learned that first in investment banking, moved on to private equity, and so really learned how to evaluate business. But fortunately had an opportunity in grad school where I worked with the microbiome startup and really had the first taste of thrilling experience taking bench science to commercial enterprise, but also learned a lot of naivety first time around. So that led me to the Bay Area, and where I joined an early stage company called Vir Biotechnology. So Vir, in the early days, it was still stealth, very small, and squarely focused in infectious disease at a time when pharma is exiting the field. Because not profitable for many reasons. And lo and behold, a couple years later, COVID hit, and really was the right place, right time, compressing the timeline, developed a anti-COVID-19 antibody drug, in 18 months. So real thorough experience. And after that, had an opportunity to join Arch, where really the goal is to see a swath of technologies. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Sue. And Max, may I ask you to do the same, please?
Absolutely, yeah. Happy to be here. My name is Max Farina. I'm a senior associate at 5AM Ventures. I'm a physician by training. I went to medical school at Yale, but pretty quickly after getting there, realized that I was noticing a real lack of effective therapies for many patients, and so I became more interested in the world of biotech. Was really enthralled by the promise of taking novel scientific discoveries and translating those into new, more effective therapies for patients. And so after graduating, I went to Goldman Sachs for a couple of years, working in their investment banking group in New York. I saw a variety of biotech companies, worked across different therapeutic areas, different modalities, companies facing different business challenges at different points in their life cycle. And really enjoyed that. I feel like it was a great way to get to know the industry of biotech, a little bit about drug development, who the major players are. And so was there for 2 years and then decided I wanted to get a little bit closer to the science. And so I ended up joining 5AM Ventures on the investment team, focused on therapeutics. 5AM does do some non-therapeutics deals as well. But maybe just to share a little bit of background on the firm. So as the name implies, we are early stage investors in life science, much like Arch. We have been around for 20 years, about 80% in therapeutics, but we invest across the life sciences. So that's me and 5AM.
Thank you both for that introduction, and I think it's interesting to see the pathways of people to see where they are today as a background to the conversation. But we're going to dive right now into the main question of this session, which is, what are you observing in life sciences investment right now as trends? And maybe if you could also comment a little bit on the characteristics of startups that you're seeing being more successful at this time with these changing trends. So who wants to go first?
Sure, I can kick us off.
Lead us off.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with an obvious statement, which is that this is a historically challenging environment to raise capital in biotech right now. We saw about $5 billion in private funding go into life science companies last quarter. Compare that to over $12 billion a quarter during the biotech peak in early 2021. So, down 60% in terms of financing volumes. That's a really, really meaningful change in just the tone of both investors and entrepreneurs. I do think that if you sort of parse the data a little bit and dig into the details, there's an interesting trend, which is that the closer a company is to public markets, they are more impacted by these headwinds and by these challenges. And I think that makes sense just sort of looking at where the biotech markets are today. But to put some numbers on it, which I think can be helpful, I said 60% down in terms of financing volumes from 2 years ago. If you look at Series C financing specifically, that number is 85%. So really just decimated for companies that are looking for late-stage private funding. Series B's down 65%, so faring a little bit better, but still quite challenging. And even Series A's, which are the most insulated from this trend, still down 45% in terms of deal volumes. So it's really tough across the board. But if we think about valuations specifically, it's a bit of a different story, which I think is really interesting. And that's, Series C valuations down 60%, Series B valuations down 30%. But on the early stage, in seed and Series A financings in the life sciences, this number is up 30%. So valuations, pre-money valuations for early stage companies are actually up in this challenging environment. And so I think to sort of put that together, what does that mean? Yes, there are fewer dollars flowing into the space right now, but there is still certainly demand for early stage companies, particularly high quality ideas. And there are investors like 5AM and Arch who are really excited to put capital to work today into great ideas. And so maybe get at the second part of your question of, what companies are we seeing that we're excited about? What are some of those characteristics? I do think that in this environment, many investors are shifting their preferences a bit. I think both in terms of the types of companies that they invest in and also how we're investing in those companies. And so in terms of the types of companies that we're investing in, I'd say that when IPO markets are tough and it's not really a viable path to exit, or a reliable path to exit, I should say, we think a lot more about M&A and what types of companies are acquirable and where acquirers have been interested recently. And I think recently that has been more in common diseases. So, diabetes, other metabolic disease, cardiovascular, inflammation, immunology. So these are some of the areas where I think there's sort of increased investor interest right now. I think what goes hand in hand with that is just more traditional modalities are really coming into vogue again, so small molecules and biologics. There was a real frenzy for advanced modalities like cell and gene therapy and gene editing over the last 10 years. And I think that has started to cool a little bit, both because of how capital intensive those modalities are, and so it's challenging to capitalize those well in this environment. But also just that there are some real fundamental scientific challenges as well that have started to emerge in terms of safety and regulatory path and commercial reimbursement for those modalities. So I do think that investors are sort of taking a step back, certainly still quite interesting, and I think long-term potentially transformative therapies, but there is a bit of a shift towards more traditional modalities in the early stage companies. And I might just end by saying that, there is also a slight shift in the how we're investing in these companies, and I'd say that at 5AM specifically, we have become much more focused on funding through clinical data in a Series A, which has not always been the norm. I think there are certainly was an environment where you could raise a Series B on having a development candidate in hand, and that's certainly not the world that we're living in today. And so I think to the extent that companies can really focus on generating clinical data, that really is a differentiated profile for many investors, especially traditional investors in this space.
Thank you. So, any?
Yeah, no, I concur with what Max says, many of the points that you raised. I would say when you look at the year-over-year funding amounts, a lot of times, I think during the 2021 timeframe, there's a little bit of artificial inflation. You see a lot of new investors coming into this otherwise pretty specialized areas. So, try to ride the wave and really gaining advantage in the marketplace. And I think when 2022 turned the corner, the marketplace has cooled down, so you do see exit of certain non-traditional investors. So I think maybe interpreting the data just based on the time horizon. I would say, much to Max's point, there's still a lot of funding available for truly groundbreaking technologies and scientific ideas. And really, I think it comes down to what is sort of the impact that you're making. I always think that scientific ventures and therapeutics in particular is an expedition. It's 5 to 10 years, maybe 20 years if you dive into a new modality. So Fed comes and goes. It's hard to catch the timing per se, but ultimately is, are we solving a medical need? Are we doing something good for the patient? So I think that's definitely critically important. And I will echo what Max said about, I guess, certain shifts around therapeutic area focus. For some of the more advanced modalities, of course, the initial proof of concept is in a small population, something executable, something you can show very quickly in the clinic. And I think the next logical question is, with the investment putting in, with the manufacturing potential challenges, how to roll out this medicine, what's your path to go after broader populations, not just from a dollar return or investment return perspective, but also from a scale of impact. So I think there is definitely a renaissance we're seeing in the common diseases. So obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, by any measure, whether it's pharma interests or the staggering profits made by Ozempic. I think I read somewhere that Novo Nordisk just a couple weeks ago has their market cap has surpassed Danish economy GDP. So truly staggering. So I think what that does is it does do really well to stimulate these traditionally sort of overlooked areas for biotech, and there's a lot of interest in new modalities, new technology, new targets for these common diseases. And the other example that Max mentioned is also immunology. There's so many inflammatory disease, chronic conditions. The current treatments are okay, but not great. Maybe 1 in 3 patients respond, and very soon they relapse. Many of them are not life-threatening, but they're truly debilitating in terms of quality of life. So there's a ton of innovation, I think, opportunities in our areas. And I think so both of you touched on in this particular funding environment, what are the things that companies should be thinking about? I'm personally always very fascinated by small molecule modality. I think you see this a return of going back to small molecule. Think about common disease as well. You want something that's oral, easy to take, cheap to make, right? Injectables are great, but many parts of the world can't access. So I truly believe some of the fundamental tools we have in the drug discovery toolboxes are really going to make a significant differences in the current environment. And on top of that, as a company, when you develop small molecule drugs and leveraging a lot of really interesting tools these days, chemoproteomics, looking at new targets, higher throughput, functional assays and making available for cheap, relatively speaking, really give you a leverage to start a company in this space.
Wonderful, thank you both. Before I go to my next question, for the audience, this is going to be my last question if you have questions. So we have a microphone up there. Raise your hand again, sorry. So if you have a burning question, plan on asking it after this next one. So my question to you is, given the trends that you're seeing, what are the real advice to a current founder or startup that's really at this stage and really looking to get some funding? What are your advices about this? stick it out. This is going to change. Like, what are you anticipating? So do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll start. I think I will reiterate and echo a lot of things that James and Artie already said.
Yeah.
Leverage relationship and going way back is really critical. This is a people business. End of the day, it's a long journey to get a drug out of the door. And I think going back to the sort of the fundamental philosophical level, like really focus on a solution that meets an unmet medical need. Let everything else sort of play out. But that's really, I think going back to first principle, what is the problem you're solving for, and what is the competitive landscape looks like, and how you're differentiated, so on and so forth. And I think I always echo, since already you're talking about RNA medicines, I think about, in that field, there's always something is hot and then it becomes cold and hot again. This is just inevitable business cycles, right? So I think having that true North Star, really knowing your strength and the problem you're solving is going to be hugely critical. And I also want to echo the point of resilience. I think it's important for fundraising and important for being this otherwise very tough business. And I've also heard founders, very experienced founder entrepreneurs of exit in the past, have also talked to hundreds of VCs until they get their financing in place, right? So, there's a lot of up and downs, and setbacks inevitable. I think buckle up.
Great. Max?
Yeah, definitely agree with all of that. And so, I think maybe just to add, maybe two pieces of advice for fundraising today, and one is more specific to this environment, and one I think is just more general. But the specific piece is sort of to what I was saying before. To the extent that you can end your Series A with clinical data in hand, that's really helpful, and definitely acknowledge that that's easier said than done, and not always in your control as an entrepreneur. But I think we see a lot of companies now stretching as far as they can on non-dilutive funding. Really prioritizing pipelines to make sure that the lead program has the runway it needs to turn over meaningful clinical data cards. And so that profile is differentiated in this market and certainly garners attention. I think that the more general piece of advice is just building on something that Sue said is, I think, be really explicit about what the use case is. And I think that there was certainly a market environment where you could come to VCs with a really cool science idea and raise $100 million to, go out and build the platform and, figure out the strategy during the Series A and run a bunch of proof of concept experiments and figure out where to point the technology. And I think we're seeing that much more rarely today. And, I think it's so important to come with your pitch sort of built in with an idea of what the clinical need is that you're addressing and sort of why that's commercially attractive. And I think that burden, whereas it sort of used to be, I think, seen as a partnership, and it still is certainly a partnership during the Series A, but I think that Series A investors today, are now expecting academics, tech transfer offices, advisors to small companies to have a really concrete view coming into the pitch of what those applications are, and they need to be sort of applications that resonate with investors.
Yeah, maybe I would just add, and then that's a really important point just from a strategy and mapping your execution perspective. It's always really exciting to have a platform company because it provides optionalities and give you a pipeline. But oftentimes it's really the tension of balancing platform development with having a deep pipeline where you progressible into the clinic. And ultimately, we're in the business of making drugs, not in the business of experimenting cool science. So having that balance and be really, really careful of what's your first lead indication, because you will be judged on the first program, despite the strength of your platform.
Great. Okay, any questions from our audience? The mic is up there, like I said. If you can walk up to the mic and ask your question, please, we would appreciate it. And we're going to take 2 questions from the audience.
Hi, I have a question. Thank you for the amazing sharing today. Yeah, I'm curious, given the global nature of life science research, how do geopolitical factors and international partnerships impact your investment decisions and portfolio diversification?
Did you hear that? Great. So does the audience need us to repeat it? Okay, go ahead.
That's a really good question. I'm a foreigner myself. I grew up in China, and over the years, it's really becoming a hub for a lot of manufacturing and outsourced research resources, and really, I think, part of the global ecosystem to fuel the startup. With the COVID-19 shutdown, we definitely see the impact of companies here in the US and in Europe being able to do research effectively. So I think a tactical advice from companies based in the US in San Diego is being able to diversify your supplier base and always have a backup, having the military precision of 2 is 1, 1 is none mentality when it comes to planning your research.
Yeah, and maybe just take that a different direction. I think from the investment side and sort of diversifying a VC portfolio in terms of geography. I think we've seen an interesting trend over the last few years of a bridging between U.S. and European VC markets in biotech. And so now I think most U.S.-based VCs are doing a significant amount of deal flow in Europe, and we've also seen, I think, some really impressive mega funds raised from European VCs now cross-pollinating ideas, bringing their seeds over to the U.S. and vice versa. And so, I think that, it's nice that those ideas are all mixing together, but then it does also sort of synchronize the risk as well. The risk of, I think European markets are just as impacted as this downturn as the U.S. markets, and I guess. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we're all in the same boat, so it's interesting.
Great. Have another question?
Thank you. I'm representing a company that developed a disruptive medical device, and due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the industry's kind of turned upside down. A lot of the current devices in the market are now being recalled, and they could not have been recalled for several years due to the COVID-19 pandemic and emergency use. So it's a bit of a blue ocean right now for infusion devices. However, we face challenges with Series A funding because medical device development's life cycle is extraordinarily long, and there's a lot of barriers to entry with large Fortune 500 companies basically dominating the market. What do you recommend for entering Series A funding, given these hurdles?
Max, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can start with what I'm sure will be an unsatisfactory answer. We don't invest in devices, and so I don't have, I think, a ton of good specific advice for that situation, unfortunately. But I do think that probably a lot of the same advice that we were talking about, just generally is applicable for medical devices. But I'm not familiar with sort of the dynamics at play in the regulatory environment right now. Maybe Sue is, but I don't.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not qualified to comment on medical device. But in general, I think the competition that you mentioned in therapeutics would face the same. Fortune 500 companies, the Lilly of the world, and
right.
With so much resources, and why do biotechs exist, right? I think a lot of time it's, not necessarily it's a unique scientific insights, but maybe it's your execution, is your cycle of innovation, is your cycle times that really beat up a organization that's 500,000 people and stuffed with middle management. So I think there's a lot of angles to tackle it. And so really truly being able to pitch what's unique and different that you're building versus a bigger guys with large resources that cannot get to, I think that would be key in my opinion.
Great, thank you. I actually miscalculated my time. We have room for one more question. Anyone else? If not, I have one for the panel. Yeah. We're going to do a jumping exercise over there.
Okay, thank you very much, Sue and Max. You mentioned you're mainly in therapeutics, but what about the diagnostic area? In particular, there's some new drugs, like antibody drug conjugates, that tremendous benefit to people with metastatic cancers, but the current diagnostic tools are not really adequate to identify those patients. What do you think of funding that type of a venture?
I would say Completely agree. I, at 5AM, was involved in building a company through our 459 initiative, specifically focused on this, and they're coming out of stealth next month, so I would say keep your eye on the 5AM homepage for a company announcement that's highly relevant to that. But yeah, fully agree. I think that a lot of the data from targeted oncology therapeutics, particularly ADCs, has been extremely impressive and really turbocharged that entire therapeutic area. But the bottleneck has emerged as being finding the right patients for this condition, and I think in these conditions, and I think the HER2 data earlier this year also showed that maybe those populations are even broader than we previously thought, and so really finding new diagnostic tools, new approaches, and new ways of thinking about patient segmentation. I think you're gonna see a lot more of that over the next few years.
No, I absolutely concur. I think historically, maybe diagnostic is the less sexy little brother of therapeutics, but it's a little bit of chicken and egg situation. If you can diagnose, but you have no drug, but you have drugs, you can't find the patients. So really, really excited to see this cycle has been broken. And I think in addition to target oncology, there's a lot of interesting genomics findings in immunology, diseases where we think is inherently heterogeneous, but now have a much better scientific underpinning of the pathology and the linking to certain genetic variants, which again leads to precision, not just oncology, but immunology. So I think there will be a lot of areas for applications.
Okay, so I'm going to end by, I had initially had one more question for the panel, but in the interest of time, I actually want to ask them to, as we prepped for this panel, I asked them that question. And I want them to maybe respond in a much shorter version in the question of what you told me in response to the question at the time about the San Diego market. So my question to them was the following. It seems like the reputation of San Diego is a surfer city. It is not a life science outside of many places, right? We know it is a life sciences place, but it's not always the reputation we get as a city. And so my question to both of them was, why do you think that is, and how does your portfolio look like in relation to that?
Yeah, actually, both Max and I chuckle because for 5AM and Arch, we have a ton of portfolio companies here. And as someone who lives in California, I don't understand why people want to be in Boston and do biotech. It's amazing here. But I do think there's a perception problem, or a perception issue or challenge, if you will. There's the talent pool, the ecosystem, and there's also the temporal pace. You need to have big pharma around, right? Art's story, which is really, really illuminating, I think. So I think San Diego has all the key ingredients, and yeah.
Yeah, maybe to get specific about 5M's portfolio, we have far more portfolio companies in San Diego than we do in the Bay Area. So we love this ecosystem. Really excited to continue supporting it. And maybe just for my take on why maybe that disconnect is I think generally seen. I think there's also a chicken and egg situation of where investors live, and a lot of early stage investors live in San Francisco and Boston, and I do think that events just like this that bring investors into the ecosystem in person, face-to-face, meeting exciting companies, does wonders to really inject more capital into the ecosystem. So kudos to you and the whole team for putting this together.
Well, thank you to both of you. And we heard the previous panel also talk about that this is one of the most supportive ecosystems for life sciences. And so certainly really something we hope to continue to advertise and bring more investment into the region. Thank you both for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Hala.
I really feel passionate about sharing the San Diego talent, elevating San Diego, because it is the best place to be an entrepreneur.